Is on vacation in the Virgin Islands, and he didn't ask me to fill in the Virgin Islands for him, just here. Why did he ask me? I don't know, except that I've lived next door to Tunisia for a while in Libya, so maybe there's some lesson there. If we talk about the Arab Spring, my view is that Tunisia and Libya are right now the bookends, because one was violent and relatively quick, one was unviolent and relatively quick. The other was very violent, very lethal, and took 9 or 10 months to complete itself. Now, Syria is competing for the honors of being even bloodier, but we'll see where that goes. Anyway, I'm supposed to welcome you to the, one thing is Christian didn't trust me, so he scripted me. So I have to read all this. Let me get out my glasses. Welcome to the Wilson Center. This is the Washington History Seminar. As I said, I'm a senior scholar. The co-sponsor of this seminar is the National History Center, which is an initiative of the American Historical Association, and Roger Lewis, sitting to my right, is here every week to represent the National History Center. We need to acknowledge the support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations for supporting the weekly seminar. And I'd like to thank Mary and Barbara of the National History Center and Allison Leakoff of the Wilson Center for helping to organize the event. We have the privilege and the pleasure of welcoming and listening to Professor Julia Clancy Smith as our featured speaker this week. Now, the title of her talk up until last Friday, that's only 3 days ago, was Tunisia and the Origins of the Arab Spring. It has now become, as you know, the Barbary Coast, and colonialism and the Mediterranean, circa 1800 to 2011. So it's a little broader than you may have originally thought, certainly than I originally thought, but I think it's going to be a pleasure to hear it. Julia Clancy Smith is a Wilson Center Fellow this year, Professor of History at the University of Arizona at Tucson. I like Tucson very much. She has written numerous publications, including Mediterraneans, North Africa, and Europe in the Age of Migration, which is my duty to wave at you, show you this book, which is supposedly excellent, and hope that if you haven't already purchased it, you will. It won the French Colonial History Society Book Award and the 2011 Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society Award. She's also written, have I got this right, the Rebel and Saint, Muslim Notables, Popular Protest, Colonial Encounters, which received 3 book awards, and authored a chapter in Contesting Archives, Finding Women in the Sources, an edited volume that won a 2011 book award from the Western Association of Women Historians. Quite an impressive background. Ms. Clancy Smith has also published numerous journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, and book and film reviews. In 2006, the AHA, I suppose that's the American History Association, awarded her the James Harvey Robinson Prize for outstanding contribution to the teaching and learning of history. And in 2010, she was awarded the AHA's William Gilbert Award for Best Article on Teaching History. She holds a BS and MA in history from Georgetown and a PhD from UCLA. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Roger to make additional remarks. And then, Roger, do you want to go around as we usually do and have people introduce themselves?
That would be a great help. If
okay,
we could
well,
just go around the table and let people.
I'll call on you first, and then we'll go around the table if that's okay.
Let me just say that it's a great pleasure to have Julia here as our guest. I'm very glad that we're able to persuade her to speak to the seminar, and I think it would help Julia to get a sense of the audience if we were to go around and let people briefly identify themselves.
And here's the microphone starting to my left.
Arnita Jones, Director Emerita from the American Historical Association.
I'm Stanley Falk. I'm a military historian.
Name is Red Austin, and I'm a student of Indian constitutional history.
Nancy Austin, wife.
This should be.
Al Schmitz, retired historian and presently a visiting scholar, GW.
Marjorie Lightman, partner in QED Associates, historian, The Ancient World.
Bill Zeisel, a partner in QED Associates and trained as a medievalist.
Dane Kennedy, GW History.
Larissity Sudhir, American Historical Association.
Charlotte Bemengia, a recent graduate from Marymount University, exploring international relations and community development.
Angela Santese, visiting scholar here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Christine Kelly, and I'm an intern at the National History Center.
Sean Wen, I'm a PhD student in history at Georgetown University.
Madeline Velturo, and I'm a research assistant here at the Wilson Center.
Don Wolfensberger, Congress Scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Kent Hughes, Director of the Program on America and the Global Economy and volunteer carrier of lecterns.
Randy Sim, retired attorney.
Zed David, I'm a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Paul Rockauer, Director of Communications for American Voices.
Jim Grossman, American Historical Association.
James Sang, retired physicist.
I'm Roger Lanius from the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian.
Dave Ottaway, senior scholar, and I lived in Algeria at the time of its independence for 3 years.
Philippa Strom, a senior scholar at the Wilson Center.
Stephen Shore, financial analyst.
Marion Barber, Associate Director of the National History Center.
Is there someone left? Yes, I can't see them.
Joe Freeman, senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, sitting comfortably out of sight.
Well, if you want to remain out of sight, it's okay with me, but I'm sorry. Julia, we're going to turn it over to you, okay. But I have to warn you that we expect you to talk 45 minutes, not a second longer. Okay. But if you do talk a little over, that's okay, but we need to get some Q's and A's in before the end of the hour and a half. So it's up to you. Okay.
Well, thanks to, first of all, to Roger and Christian, even though he is in the Virgin Islands, to the National History Center, the Wilson Center fellows, staff, scholars, and particularly to Ambassador Milam for his generous introduction. And it's also great to see colleagues and friends from the D.C. area, from Dane Kennedy, people from the AHA, whom I haven't seen in a while, so it's great that you're all here. I'm going to be shamelessly promotional, and in the first part of my lecture, and talk about how my book. This is where you hold it up one more time.
One more time.
How my book Mediterraneans came to be, as well as the historical problems that I encountered along the way. But I'll also connect several core arguments derived from the 19th century case to what has recently transpired and is still unfolding in North Africa, especially Tunisia. And I'd like to argue that by looking at floating hinterlands, coastalization, and the Mediterranean palace as political target, we can make a plea for a longue durée history when considering the so-called Arab Spring. So first of all, how did Mediterraneans come about? And that brings me to the Barbary coasts part of the title of my talk. In a recent article, Vanity Fair depicted Los Angeles as the Barbary coast of the American West, something I found intriguing. I lived in LA while at UCLA for my PhD, and moved frequently between California, France, and Europe, and the real Barbary coast for years doing research. Yet I'd never considered the city in this light before, although clearly the characterization celebrated the heterogeneous transnational makeup of LA citizens and their uncommonly strange behavior. But what struck me most was the fact that the centuries-old moniker, Barbary Coast, imposed by outsiders upon North Africa and its peoples to demarcate the civilized from the uncivilized, that this label had been redeployed to mean something new, positive, in terms of LA's allure as a place of mobilities, of people in motion. So what about the other Barbary Coast, the real one? One of the questions that eventually drove my book, Mediterraneans, was exactly that. Why leave home for North Africa in the 19th century, home being mainly the adjacent Catholic islands such as Sicily, Malta, Sardinia, etc., or southern Europe, if Barbary was traditionally regarded as a land of danger, captivity, and apostasy, its inhabitants, the Moors, seen as, quote, pirates, corsairs, and pitiless enemies of the Christians, end of quote. How was North Africa transformed in the European collective imagination and practice into one of the most active migratory north to south frontiers in the Mediterranean basin in less than 2 decades? Once again, we're talking 19th century. The shift began in the 1820s, before 1830 and the French invasion of Algeria, although settler colonialism and France's long, bloody pacification of Algeria greatly accelerated the process. So what historical factors, small and large, convinced Italian, Spanish, Maltese, or Sicilian peasants that this place of, quote, idolatrous oppression, end of quote, offered opportunities for good fortune, for making it in life, mainly through labor migration? And how did they leave? More to the point, how did they arrive in North Africa? And what kinds of welcome was afforded them? It took a long time to formulate questions such as these. Along the way, I had to reconsider new and old forms of trans-sea movement, new forms and old forms of empire, and visual imperialism, among many other things. But what did my initial journey look like? That is, my intellectual journey. In earlier stages, the book project focused upon trans-sea contraband, smuggling, and illicit flows in the 19th century to argue for repositioning North Africa vis-a-vis the Mediterranean and the emerging field of neo-maritime studies. Ironically, perhaps, years of running after contrebandiers and probing black and gray markets, trust networks, and clandestine as well as brazen extra-legal exchanges, that forced the framing narrative in other larger directions, including human contraband and contraband identities. In the end, it was the stories or fragments of stories that led to migration as the big picture. Needed was a small space to watch all the traffic going by. And this is where I deeply regret the fact that my flash drive with all of my images didn't work. I either erased my images, including lots of maps, or I perhaps left the wrong flash drive or the right one back in Tucson. In any case, I'm going to ask you to sort of visually imagine the Mediterranean basin. So I was looking for a small place to watch all the traffic going by. Situated along the Sicilian Channel, the Tunis-Carthage-Cap Bon region has long represented a major communication node or ganglia of opportunity, disappointment, or disaster. Perhaps since 800 BCE, when Queen Dido, or Elisa of Tyre, sought haven there. The Tunisian maritime borderlands provided coastal front row seats for observing not only central but also trans-Mediterranean connectivities and ruptures, as well as their historical consequences. In addition, by the 1820s, Tunisia lay astride a demographic frontier. The nearby islands suffered from population overshoot, while North Africa was, in contrast, a thinly populated land. Finally, the Beylik of Tunis, ruled by an autonomous dynasty that was theoretically under the Ottomans, the Husainids, and they ruled for a very long period of time, from 1705 until 1957, 250 years. Tunisia sat uncomfortably at a place where 3 empires converged: the Ottomans, the British in Malta after 1800, and the French in Algeria after 1830. Italian unification exerted considerable torque on population flows, as did the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, notably the Greek Wars. So I perversely chose pre-colonial and early colonial Tunisia instead of the more obvious choice, Algeria, which meant that primary sources were a serious problem, on which more in a moment, but in the end, Tunisia represented an even more complicated migratory site. And by beginning in the 1820s, I can better test the degree to which French Algeria triggered new currents of labor and other kinds of migration. Back to the stories and the sources. Archives on both sides of the Mediterranean yielded innumerable accounts of people in motion, such as the following. In 1831, the British consul in Tunis observed, quote, the Maltese, and the Maltese were British protégés, the Maltese usually come to Tunisia quite destitute. They are so much addicted to moving about that they seldom or ever remain here more than a few months, so that when they leave Tunis, they possess but little money, end of quote. 2 years earlier, in 1829, Giulio Finzi, a Jewish printer from Leghorn, sought refuge in Tunisia with waves of fellow anarchists, Freemasons, and Republicans fighting with Mazzini and Garibaldi. I should say parenthetically that the Finzi family remains in Tunis to this day and is still in the Italian printing publishing business. Back to the 19th century. Military campaigns in neighboring Algeria from 1830 on not only drove Algerian Muslims and Jews across the border into pre-colonial Tunisia, but also folks like Annetta, a Spanish woman born in Algiers who relocated to Tunis to set up burglary and fencing operations in the 1850s and 1860s. Chaste Catholic nuns were literally chased out of Algeria in 1840 by the Bishop of Algiers and Governor General and welcomed in Tunisia by Ahmed Bey. A few years later, in 1874, a Maltese coachman slyly suggested to his Sicilian lady passenger that they, quote, go for a keef in La Goulette, and La Goulette, Halkelwad, is the port, and that translates into something like, let's go have sex and drugs. This racy invitation cost him a job and triggered protracted international judicial proceedings. And then there was Nicola, allegedly a soldier in the Pope's army, who in 1870 got drunk at a tavern at the port, that is Tunis port, hurled invective at its patrons, was arrested, claimed to be a protege of at least 4 different nations, France, Italy, Greece, and Russia, before being expelled and hustled aboard a French military warship headed for Bonn in Algeria. Thousands of soldiers in the Armée d'Afrique, which was the name of the French colonial army, the largest standing army in Africa at the time, deserted their posts and fled to Tunisia. Some also fled across the border to Morocco. Small wonder that the Husseinid beys, or rulers, began issuing new kinds of edicts aimed at controlling, even denying entry to, foreign, and let's put foreign in quotes, mainly European vagrants in their kingdom from the late 1820s on. Although who and what was a foreigner is subject to debate and can only be grasped, if vaguely, through finely tuned contextualization and historicization. The weight of the archive, the compelling nature of fractured tales about mobilities and immobilities, forced me to see that trans-sea smuggling operations constituted only part of the story. All historical records are problematic, of course, but these were extremely so. Many documents had gone missing, entire series of files, accounts of proceedings, consular and bailical records often lacked a conclusion, beginning, or middle chapters. The actual physical mobility of the pre-colonial consular and the colonial archives, and I should remind you that Tunisia was incorporated into the French Empire in 1881, so 50 years after Algeria. But the mobility of these archives, not to mention repeated weeding, purging, and pillaging, determined what I could do or I could not do. For example, when the French pulled out of the 2 protectorates in 1956, that is Morocco and Tunisia, they left half of the colonial records in Tunis and Rabat and other places, taking the rest to various parts of France. And the World War II bombings of Tunis port during Axis Allied occupations destroyed many records. The early 19th century documents generally catch people when they disembark in any of Tunisia's many ports, if fortune smiles upon the historian. Thus, the prehistory of their journey, when or why they set out from Sardinia or Corsica or wherever, is elusive, particularly for ordinary folks and particularly for what I'm calling the subsistence migrants. Because of archival mobility, following people around, which is what I was trying to do, meant that if they crossed the borders between Algeria and Tunisia in the 19th century, the historian in the 20th or 21st century shuttles between Nantes, Aix-en-Provence, Paris, Kew Garden, and travels back and forth from Tunis to Algiers to France to the many Italies and beyond. So this is a familiar tale to many historians. Not all of my sources were written. I interrogated changing uses of spaces, material culture, such as clothing and food, noise and sound, and used oral data as well. But perhaps I should note that the lingua franca and diplomatic language employed by the Tunisian dynasty for communications and commercial relations with Europe was, quote, the bad Italian spoken in Barbary, end of quote, le mauvais italien parlé en Barbarie, according to many disgruntled French officials. So diverse forms of Arabic and Sicilo-Italian prevail in primary sources. But most people were illiterate in this period, 99%. And hélas, I've not yet discovered that diary that all historians want to find. For example, a written record revealing why Francesca from Pisa, a servant in Tunis who was charged with contraband in 1866, decided to leave Tuscany for the Barbary coast. Back to my own journey. The belated realization that the convergence of different kinds of migratory pulses in a historically dense choke point in the central Mediterranean, that was the story, entangled me in two huge bodies of literature. Work in numerous disciplines on migration and research into the Mediterranean. Sometime in the mid-1990s, scholars, wearied of their fixation on the nation-state and Benedict Anderson, turned back to the Mediterranean for many reasons, intellectual and political. And as hysteria in Europe over legal and extra-legal south to north immigration mounted, these two arenas of scholarly inquiry, migration and the Mediterranean, swelled and fused, becoming gargantuan. Grappling with only some of that literature set me seriously adrift for a while. Sound like I'm talking to my dean about why my book isn't out. Then, from somewhere out there came the idea of an ethnographic voyage as the book's organizing structure, recreating the processes and stages of moving about, arriving in port, settling in, etc. Perhaps my own tricontinental journeys in search of documents in and on the Barbary coast came into play, although older anthropological work such as Mary Helm's Ulysses Sail provided inspiration. But chance encounters in the archives, the Tunis Medina, or in coastal ports also played a part in the way I conceptualize my chapters. Embracing the highly fragmented documentation, I arranged and rearranged the disparate stories, the ones about Nicola, the soldier in the Pope's army getting drunk, and et cetera, so that I could imagine and track travelers and immigrants, newcomers and natives disembarking in Tunis port, struggling to secure employment in a pre-colonial and pre-industrial state, settling into neighborhoods, forging social networks, getting into trouble, and that generated most of my documentation, seeking protection or legal redress, or thrown onto the next ship putting into La Goulette, only to be dumped in another Mediterranean port. Thus, the chapters came to be arranged topically, each addressing key debates in migration studies. For example, work, legal pluralism, sociabilities, networks, and so forth. And so I have actually sort of a series of 3 chapters devoted to making a living, one of which is called domestic service and other forms of employment. However, and perhaps paradoxically for me as someone who does women's history, women and gender proved nearly intractable for chapter conceptualization. While literature on the Mediterranean world is massive, as I've just said, one critical domain calls for more research, how gender shape physical and other kinds of displacements, including status mobility. Frontiers of various kinds, notably sea borders and port cities, have long been regarded as locators of vice, as sites of social disorder and promiscuity. Women traveling alone, or even not traveling alone, but particularly women without men, have almost always and everywhere been morally suspect, subject to special gendered regulations while on board ship or in port. An earlier version of the book devoted a separate chapter to women as immigrants, but this strategy confined them to an interpretive quarantine rather than full integration into the narrative. So that material was eventually collapsed into all the other chapters, which earned me a gentle rebuke from one of my reviewers, although there is an entire chapter entitled Where Elites Meet, Households, Harem Visits, and Sea Bathing, which I think we all want to know about harem visits. So I don't know what the reviewer was grumbling about, but you can't make everybody happy. Anyway, in the course of our daily lives, we all leave crumbs behind, providing potential evidence for history stories. At least that's what I tell my students in my historical methods course. But telling tales demands awareness of how we reconstruct those stories, which in many cases have been repeated endlessly long before the historian chances upon them as written evidence. Stories whispered in streets and markets, told under duress to the bailiwickal police or to consular authorities, and so forth. Thus, the book's narrative strategy varied according to the topic under consideration. But it also varied according to how I was feeling at any given moment. At times, I imagined myself to be an insider to the micro events of a particular day, a gossipy person in the Tunis Medina slandering a female neighbor's honor. At others, I assumed the guise of a somewhat detached outside observer. In short, hang gliders and truffle hunters, fine-grained cameo and bird's-eye views, pointillist realism were among my narrative strategies. In addition, I attempted to impart some experiential sense of people on the move through microbiographies of the spaces and places that social actors inhabited or moved through, to provide sensory and visual thick description. For example, to assess the importance of novel sounds, such as bands of thieves whistling at night before a heist in the Tunis Medina, or distasteful and new noises like Sardinian families recently arrived, boisterously celebrating Christmas Eve in an inebriated state, much to the dismay of their Muslim and Jewish neighbors. Streetwise portrayals of daily, yearly, and protracted encounters between native Tunisians, and that's in quote, and the newcomers allowed me to sort out, to a degree, those claiming authentic native status, folks seen as utterly foreign, people seen as not quite indigenous, not quite European, residual Creoles produced by elective cultural naturalization in Tunisia, or familiar strangers, although there was considerable traffic between these porous categories. Another and final conundrum I faced was how to narrate the history of the 19th century Mediterranean from the vantage point of North Africa and North Africans. That is, employing mainly local records rather than European accounts. After all, the modern world is incomprehensible without a social history of the sea that is attentive to oppositional cultures among seamen on ships or port laborers whose toil underwrote the global maritime economy. Ports functioned as the interface between North African producers and trans-sea distribution networks, presenting the first or last chance for the state to tax, limit, or prescribe commerce and population movements. However, I found that Tunisian literati, the keepers of the record, generally did not devote much attention to the Mediterranean as such, at least not in the early part of the century. Nor did they pay too much attention to the newcomers who streamed into ports, except to send endless, bitter complaint letters to the bays about the untoward behavior of the immigrants. Indigenous sailors, captains, and fishermen are largely absent from the primary historical records. As for the secondary literature, thus far, contemporary scholars have ignored the history of maritime communications between the Maghreb and Europe, for example, and what little scholarship exists rarely finds its way into conventional accounts. The shape of the field of North African history had much to do with this, although it's changing rapidly right now. Until recently, the Maghreb was portrayed as historically acted upon, rather than the reverse. Not quite Arab, not quite African, not quite European, not quite Middle Eastern. North Africa occupied a space forged by essentialisms. Not too long ago, the eminent French geographer Jean Despois held that l'Afrique du Nord, once again he's talking about French North Africa, had not contributed anything or very little to world civilization, which for centuries had been a gift bestowed by invaders, conquerors, and outsiders. The very old tenacious notion of Muslims as interlopers in the Mediterranean, of Barbary pirates, and of Arab Berber culture as immobile and immutable remains alive in some quarters. the ancient Mediterranean is still portrayed as a Greek and Roman lake, which excises or erases Carthage, much to my horror. A final objective in the book was to make the Mediterranean not only a frame, but also one of many actors, to factor in shifting geospatial registers and scales, including the impact of winds and currents, winter, summer sailing seasons, ecology, climatology, etc., that have always shaped technologies of movements. Navigation records from the mid-19th century that I excavated from the PRO in Kew outside of London, which Roger knows well, demonstrated that island hopping and coastal hugging from Livorno, for example, and I do wish I could have gotten that map up there, from Livorno to Sicily to Tunis was the norm, even after the introduction of steam shipping in the 1840s. This may partially explain Livorno's prominence in all manner of Tunisian-Italian exchanges, in addition to Leghorn's peculiar legal status, and why we find a prosperous Tuscan Jewish merchant elite, as well as female domestics, from northern Italy in Tunis from the 19th century on, if not before. In addition, the centrality of micro-islands, and I'm still talking about Mediterranean not as only as frame but as social actor, the centrality of micro-islands to migratory patterns, whether south-north or the reverse, can't be overemphasized. Indeed, in the late 1870s, on the cusp of the protectorate, which once again was imposed in 1881, nearly two-thirds of the population of nearby Lampedusa relocated to the Cap Mont to farm. As many of you recall, with the Tunisian uprisings in April 2011, Berlusconi warned darkly of a human tsunami sweeping the island of Lampedusa, closest to Tunisia. These micro-islands, so crucial to human displacements over the past millennia, actually made it into the U.S. papers for the first time. To sum up, what I was after, I guess you would say I was after the clarity of mutability. The web was favored over the line. As an adjacent possible or possibility, leaving home has always cohabitated with staying put, historically speaking. And migrants were more than simply that. But who was a migrant, and what was a migrant? What mental universe moved with them, and how did motion alter or subvert that universe? And how mundane was the short passage from Marsala in western Sicily, where many Sicilians embarked from, or from La Valletta, the port city for Malta? Okay, let me share a little bit with you of what I found once I was able to assemble this record. The first thing that you need to know is that in contrast to all other North African ports, including Alexandria in around 1800, Tunis had long hosted a mercantile community of French Huguenots from the 17th century on, as well as expatriates, and once again that term is subject to caution. I put it in quotes. Expatriates from Livorno, Greeks, and a floating, Greeks, etc., and a floating unstable population of enslaved or captive persons. The presence of these communities, particularly that Huguenot trading community, and I've called some of them cultural Creoles, acted as a magnet later in the 19th century for other would-be immigrants, no matter what their motivations for leaving home. Tunis, in effect, unlike Alexandria in 1800, or Beirut, or Tanger, resembled Istanbul in miniature, with the exception that no indigenous Christian Arab community existed anywhere in North Africa. We don't know how many settled in pre-colonial Tunisia, or as importantly, who came and moved on. No one was counting the people who count. British consuls in Tunisian ports, who were often not really British at all, drew up impressive-looking charts and tables for London, but privately acknowledged statistical failure. By the middle of the 19th century, let's say about 1850, approximately 10 to 15% of the capital city's population, that is Tunis, is estimated at about 100,000. 10 to 15. Most were these were the newcomers, and most were from islands, which is very important. The Maltese were the most numerous until the 1860s, and then the Sicilians began pouring in from the 1860s and 1870s on, bringing with them the mafia as well. So there was a Tunisian branch of the mafia. In contrast, in British-ruled Cairo after 1882, only 5% of the capital city's population was, quote, foreign or European. The Tunis region received by far the highest percentage, but all ports, small and large, experienced immigration of one sort or another. Moreover, one cannot sever eastern colonial Algeria from these patterns of displacement, since ports from Bon or Annaba to the east of Algiers, to Tabarka, which is in northern Tunisia, once again, I wish I had my map, down to Jerba, which is adjacent to Libya, that Bill knows so well. But these were all involved in these migratory flows and fluxes. Okay, so why leave home? In some cases, it was just sheer bad luck. Sometimes people set sail thinking that they were going to the Americas, and they ended up thrown off a ship on the coast of Algeria because they couldn't pay their passage. Some people made a wrong turn. Sometimes mistake and misfortune brought them to North Africa. So serendipity played a large role. Often it was by design. There were rumors of free land circulating among the Catholic Mediterranean islands, particularly rumors of free land in French colonial Algeria. I've also discovered that they were the 19th century version of coyotes who were recruiting people and promising if they got on this ship and went to North Africa that gold and all kinds of a fortune awaited them, and of course they were bitterly disappointed. In addition, travel became easier and faster with steamships. But steam was pricier, and it was mainly middling folks traveled on the new steamships. So many of the subsistence migrants arrived in fishing vessels, which meant you didn't have to pay a lot of money and you didn't need any papers, which also, of course, makes the historian's job much more difficult. Earlier, I mentioned the impact of visual imperialism, and this was mainly attracted bourgeois job seekers to North Africa, both Algeria and Tunisia. After the defeat of the Algerians during the 1816 Exmouth expedition, Henry Aston Barker, a very prominent English artist, drew a vast, enormous panorama entitled The Defeat of the Algerines. And this panorama circulated not only in London and then across the British Isles, but toured the continent, where it drew thousands and thousands of paying customers to see this great panorama. And then after 1830, there are more and more visual representations of the Maghreb as a tamed place, a subjugated place. So one of the arguments I made in my book is that the impact of visual imperialism in Europe in convincing people that North Africa was no longer a place of idolatry and apostasy. As for the kinds of migratory patterns that we find temporary work migration turning into permanent settlement. We find circular as well as return migration. Some of the islanders sort of go in and out like they're on some sort of a bus or something, a metro between Valletta and Tunis, and then eventually they strike out for Alexandria in Egypt or Australia. Many people settle permanently for generations, staying through the colonial and even the post-colonial periods. Indeed, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Tunisia, and then later when I was doing dissertation research in the 1980s in Tunisia, our car mechanic was Sicilian, and my dressmaker was Maltese, and there's still about 5,000 Italians left in Tunisia today. They're Creoles or acculturated. What kind of work awaited these folks in terms of women, gender, and networks, domestic service, and the households of the enormous ruling family, the Husseinid Beys, which had a cast of thousands in their many palaces, or the Tunis grandees offered the most possibilities. And patronage, that is domestic service, translated into patronage, which translated in access to profitable heterogeneous networks. In effect, Europeans, and once again put it in quotes, were in service to largely Muslim Arab or Turco-Arab notables. Household employment might include wet nursing and nannying, which created fictive kinship between largely Catholic Maltese or Sicilian women and Muslim clans. Networking profited the entire family, that is the immigrant family. Some left service to urban elites and with their earnings set up small businesses, cafes, taverns, hotels, etc. The infrastructure of what would become the tourist industry in the late 19th century. And the tourist industry is a pre-colonial phenomenon in Tunisia. But the single largest change was the culture of public drinking houses. And this public, because it was private before, but now it's very public. And this brings me to the question of how were the newcomers received? Well, we find the whole range of reactions. We find dismay, trepidation, indifference. We find members of the Muslim establishment, both Hanafi and Maliki ulama, denouncing the fact that these folks have introduced this public culture of drinking. But reception depended upon social class as well as the moment, and the needs of the Tunisian state for military and scientific cadres. In effect, there was a Mediterranean-wide talent hunt for skilled personnel on the part of modernizing state elites, both in Tunisia and Egypt, and they were often in competition to attract particularly military minds to their countries. Remember those colonial army deserters? Many made a new life for themselves, and a good one at that, by enlisting in the Moroccan and Tunisian armies as officers. Where people resided was also extremely important. Most inhabited the Sicilian quarter, the newer Sicilian quarter, or Nej Malta, the Street of the Maltese, which reconfigured the capital city's morphology in many ways. But many newcomers also settled into older neighborhoods in the Medina, living side by side with indigenous, that is, Arab Jews and Muslims. So there was not rigid residential segregation, at least not in Tunis, which is significant. For many of the social actors who make fleeting appearances in the book due to the problem of sources, a Sicilian proverb from the late 19th century says it all. One does not leave home with a joyous heart. To follow the continuous, sparsely documented departures of Europeans heading for the Mediterranean's Muslim shores is to track from below the grand rhythms of the long 19th century. Nation-state construction, imperialism, industrialization, boom and bust, capitalism, world market consolidation, war and violence, great power rivalry, and ecological and environmental degradation combined with population overshoot, particularly on the big islands. Okay, what kinds of quick conclusions, and then on to the Arab Spring, so-called. First of all, population transfers from Europe, that is from north to south, from Europe to Ottoman Mediterranean provinces, gathered force from the Napoleonic Wars and the occupation of Egypt, which was 1798, and endured well into the 20th century. And not just ordinary folks or peasants were lured to Muslim lands, but the 19th century's version of the IMF bankers and pashas were very prominent in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, I propose, if not a new periodization, at least a modification. Conventional thinking for the Maghreb interprets 1830, that is when the French army shows up, as a moment of total rupture. I suggest that 1798, followed by the 1816 Exmouth expedition to the Barbary coast, is where we should open our narrative. That year, massive, that is 1816, a massive Anglo-Dutch naval force bombarded or threatened to do so Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli with the stated objective of liberating thousands of Christian captives, the residue of the 18th century Mediterranean-wide coarser political economy. And I should say, parenthetically, there were thousands of North African Muslim slaves in Malta and Sicily at the same time. Exactly 2 decades later, the British Navy stormed into Tunis in 1836 in a show of gunboat diplomacy. Why? To oblige the ruler to accept additional Maltese labor migrants in his kingdom and relieve British Malta of surplus population. So back to my point that in 2 decades, everything shifted dramatically. I argue that labor and other kinds of immigration to North Africa would have occurred anyway, even without French colonialism, as the growing presence of Maltese in Tunisia during the 1820s indicates. More importantly, for questions of empire, which Roger is interested in, pre-colonial immigration to Tunisia shaped the nature of French rule after 1881, making it a rather different place from Algeria. It blurred the lines between colonizer and colonized until the end of empire, imposed limits upon what the protectorate could achieve, particularly because of the huge expatriate Sicilian Italian population in Tunisia, which always outnumbered French nationals, And immigration created a system or systems of legal pluralism that snarled and slowed colonial justice. And those who were cagey enough, both native North Africans, Tunisians, and immigrants or Creoles, could manipulate it nicely to their advantage. But that immigration and the presence of that large Italian community in Tunisia also unleashed the Franco-Italian educational Cold War that endured until after World War II. It also raises another issue. For some time, I posed the question, who was a European and what and where was Europe in the 19th century? Many of the Europeans who settled Tunisia were not regarded as European, the Maltese and Sicilian being a case in point. Moreover, looking at north to south migrations from the European rim, with an emphasis on the exiled, the expulsé, and the shoveled out, that is from Europe, as well as notorious high rollers of expanding European imperialism, integrates Europe into a Maghreb-centered narrative instead of vice versa. Along the lines of the people that were shoveled out, North Africa functioned as sort of what I've called a social poubelle. That is sort of a how would we call it, a dumping grounds for states around the Mediterranean who employed ships in the sea to rid their realms of undesirables. The French military transformed the Algerian desert into a vast open-air prison for soldiers condemned by military tribunals. The guys that got away went to Tunisia. The country was also a civilian penal colony for political opponents of the French monarchy. We need to make connections between involuntary migration, transportation, and the shape of the colonial orders in North Africa, especially in terms of violence and law, and directly then connected to various forms of migration. Migration has always been highly gendered. For historians, several basic questions remain. How did women migrate, or did they migrate in ways similar or different from men, and how was access to the sea or to travel in general, how was access to ship travel gendered, and how did gender and religion shape legal pluralism involving newly settled populations? Women as border crossers. Crown lawyers in London were greatly bothered and debated for years on end by women as border crossers. And what I mean by that was women of very ordinary status, for example, a Maltese woman who was a British protege, of ordinary status, residing in Tunis, who converted from Catholicism to Islam and then divorced her Maltese Catholic husband, as well as refusing to acknowledge the authority of the British consul. That generated loads of paper and preoccupied many, many Crown lawyers in London about what legal status they might assign to this woman. Understandings of legal protection or protege status differed not only from state to state, that is from Great Britain, France, and Italy, to name the big three involved in North Africa, but from port to port. Made on the periphery, imperial law was often made up by consuls, drawing upon indigenous legal procedures and ways of doing things. Moreover, I argue people wore legal pluralism or protection like a garment and bartered it and manipulated it to their advantage. The number of island folk who settled in Algeria or Tunisia, then returned to Sicily, for instance, only to strike out for more distant places, is significant. Circular/return labor and other kinds of movements between the islands and the North African littoral from the early 19th century may have nurtured migratory pulses across the Atlantic a bit later on in that same century. Droughts from the 1880s on, a worldwide phenomenon, forced thousands of Spaniards and Sicilians from home villages to French Algeria, colonial Tunisia, or pre-colonial Morocco when they didn't embark for the Americas. So what I'm arguing is for North Africa as a sort of a place where more restricted kinds of movement occur, and then later on members of the families once again strike out for places farther afield. I'm much bothered by the problem of the Sicilian Channel, which I can't show you because I don't have my images, but these are the kinds of things historians worry about. but in world or longue durée history, as well as floating islands and shifting hinterlands. Fernand Braudel's Les Mémoires de la Méditerranée reminds us that three principal and only three principal routes funneled traffic from the eastern and to the western wing of the basin. Two routes historically straddle the passages between Sicily and Africa, or Tunisia. Considered from this vantage point, and given the density, ubiquity, and longevity of older cartographies of movement, the flows of people, things, ideas, and species along these conduits, the prudent historian hesitates to categorically assert that things are genuinely new or novel or changed. Finally, I argue in the book that the south to north, from the 1800s on, the south to north migrations of today were directly and indirectly the product of these earlier 19th century displacements. And I'll spare you my thinking on that. So maybe we should talk about the recent upheavals and connections to the past, wherever the past may lie. So my first remark is about coastalization, floating hinterlands, and interiors, and now we're looking at the present. For 23 years, the Ben Ali regime systematically orchestrated lavish displays of Tunisia's unique Mediterranean identity, aimed mainly at European audiences. For example, Tunisia hosted the Mediterranean Games in September 2001, for which the tax-paying middle class paid dear. In Ben Ali's calculated strategy, this represented a way of not talking about Islam and Muslims on Europe's southern frontier. But another set of identities, whose genealogies are historically profound, regional, political, and economic identities, were articulated forcefully during the 2011 elections to send delegates or to select delegates for the Constitutional Assembly in Tunis. On Sunday, October 23rd, 2001, just a few months ago, in Kasserine, which is near the Algerian border, a group of women told Al Jazeera reporters the following, quote, "We are from the south and we want to vote," end of quote. But no one had informed these women that they had to register in advance to cast a ballot. Turned away from the polling station, they were triply disenfranchised as poor from the interior and women. Progressively, from the late 18th century on and rapidly during the 19th and 20th centuries, coastal cities, elites, and economic interests turned their back on Tunisia's interior and its peoples. By the late 18th century, the beys and the princes are no longer cementing alliances with tribal confederacies or confederations in the interior through marriage with local women, but much preferred Circassian and particularly or increasingly Italian wives. So that sort of gives us an index of where their heart lay. Hard scrabble places such as Sidi Bouzid, where the unemployed street vendor Bouazizi set himself on fire in December 2010, these kinds of places became more distant from the political and cultural center on the coast. The Mediterranean provinces were ever more firmly, if disadvantageously, enmeshed in trans-sea and transatlantic circuits. The floating hinterland for the Tunis-Cap Bon area became Malta, Sicily, and Marseille, even before colonialism. As we all know, geographers now sound the alarm about the global coastalization of human societies, the concentration of power. But this phenomenon, readily perceived in certain parts of North Africa, has much earlier antecedents. In the mid-18th century, with the close of the so-called Little Ice Age. The growing divergence between coast and interior widened during the Protectorate, that is 1881 to 1956, but was well underway before 1881, and was the product of many historical forces, including north to south subsistence immigration. In the 21st century, 80% of Tunisia's national production is centered on coastal areas. The interior, southwest, and center of the country, home to 40% of the population, can only claim the remaining 20%, if that. Much of it is directly or indirectly tied to tourism. The Sidi Bouzids of Tunisia have the highest unemployment or underemployment rate. It's officially 30%, but of course that means we know it's much higher. My last remark has to do with the Mediterranean villa or palace as a political target. The historical weight or purchase of the Mediterranean villa or palace in Tunisian collective memory is undeniable, although different regions of the country interpret it differently. I've traced the importance of the Mediterranean palace at least as far back to the Hafsid dynasty, which is late medieval, but I think its origins probably lie in Carthage. After the forced departure of Bouazizi's family, and I don't know if all of you are aware of the fact that because of all the media attention on the family of this poor young man who set himself on fire, relations with the townspeople and this particular family became envenomed, and in fact they were forced to leave the town. So after they departed forcibly from their own hometown, rumors in Sidi Bouzid ran wild that in fact they had just been given a Mediterranean villa, which further enraged the townspeople, who I should say parenthetically regarded Bouazizi as a hero in spite of himself. He was a local troublemaker, was a drug user, and so they really didn't appreciate the fact that this low-life guy had been made the symbol of the revolution, but that's a somewhat different story. Now, this rumor in Sidi Bouzid that the family had gotten this Mediterranean villa, and they were of very modest social means. This rumor might appear unimportant, but in fact, it's not. Let's take a long-term and quick long-term historical view. In the pre-1881 era, French or foreign-owned communication systems such as telegraph lines connecting Tunisia to Algeria and later the railway were repeatedly attacked by dissident groups. During the colonial period, as you can imagine, rural gendarmes, European agribusiness, and protectorate offices and officials were assailed by Tunisian nationalists. But the Mediterranean palaces owned by the Husainids, once again, who were on the throne for 250 years, which had been architectural expressions of power, privilege, and notability, those palaces also came to be associated with subservience to outside rule. The La Marsa Convention, signed in 1883 at the Bey's Palace by the Sea in the charming little village of La Marsa, established the military, financial, and institutional framework of the protectorate. And colonial officials, foreign consuls, and the Tunisian aristocrats enjoyed summer leisure and often wined and dined together at seaside residences. Finally, one of Bourguiba's most dramatic acts after disestablishing the dynasty in 1957 was to demolish as many of the Husainid-owned seaside palaces and gardens as possible with dynamite and huge backhoes, although mercifully he didn't get them all. After the 1987 coup, Ben Ali and the Trabelsi clan acquired as much coastal property as possible, property that had either been mulk dawla, which is to say state-owned lands, or privately owned family properties. And I know some of the families whose land was taken away from them by Ben Ali and Trabelsi, land that was confiscated for their stunning view of the Mediterranean. We now know that Leila Trabelsi purchased a 3,500 mètres carrés palace on the sea at Hammamet for 50 euros. And in one of her many palaces, 21 million euros were discovered. I guess she was keeping them under her pillow or something. It's very odd. The Mediterranean palaces, not surprisingly, were the very first targets after the revolution broke out. Now looted and trashed, they have been transformed into political shrines. Pilgrimage sites where crowds assembled to view, meditate, and celebrate the fall of the dictator. Tunisians take photos of themselves in front of the shelves of Walmart size, and I mean some of those palaces were Walmart size. They take photos of themselves to post on their Facebook pages. Of course, numerous other structures, monuments, and symbols were politically desacralized and desecrated by the protesters, but the Mediterranean palace kind of stands out for me. And if any of you have any extra cash and you're looking for a place to invest your money, the Tunisian state has now reacquired many of those palaces, and you might get a bargain basement fire sale deal on some of them. Okay, how was I? Was my economy of words, was I okay in terms of 45 minutes? Or?
Oh, I think you did just fine.
You didn't send me little pieces of paper
no,
at the AHA. You get these little pieces of paper, 10 minutes, 5 minutes.
I'm watching my watch, and there was no reason to start sending you pieces of paper. there is reason to express our appreciation because it was a very good talk. And now to go to people who want to ask questions. Please raise your hand. We have 2 people with microphones. Wait until the microphone is placed in your hand, and then identify yourself again, I'm sorry, and ask your question. And Julia will answer it.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. Well, Kent and then the guy behind Kent. Those are the first 2 hands. No fighting over the microphone.
Kent wants to know how to buy a palace, right?
Yeah. I will.
For 50
that was my
euros.
first question. Number one, I was struck, of course, by the richness of your presentation and how many forces have impinged on what we now think of as the Maghreb. Suddenly, Ottoman Empire, the inheritors of the Ottoman Empire are being more active diplomatically, it would seem, all over the Middle East. I wondered, one, what degree of Ottoman heritage is there in the Maghreb? And 2, is there enough that there would be some resentment about a renewed Turkish initiative?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, as you know, Morocco was never part of the Ottoman Empire, although despite all the hostilities between the Sharifian dynasty and the Alawi, rather, and the Ottomans, there were lots of exchanges. So that's an old myth that needs to be put to rest about the nothing but contestation. Now, the Tunisians are the most fond. I mean, once again, we're talking about historical memory. They're the most fond of the Turks. And although they were disappointed in 1881 when the Turkish fleet didn't show up, after the French fleet showed up in port and the army crossed the border, a lot of people went down to the port and hoped that the Ottomans would come and save them. They've really retained the most of their Ottoman cultural, or maybe it's reconstructed identity, but there are very close ties between Tunis and Ankara and Istanbul. And Tunisians sort of celebrate their Ottoman identity as they do their Andalusian identity. They often celebrate Turkish cuisine, although there's not a big difference between Turkish and Tunisian cuisine. Turkish music. So there's a constant sort of cultural and economic flow between the 2 countries today. The Algerians have a much different view of the relationship to the Ottoman past, and generally are somewhat, well, they were in the 19th century, of course, and 20th century, they were actually quite hostile to the Ottomans because they had expected the Ottoman military and army to deliver them from the French, and no help was forthcoming. So the Algerians have a rather different relationship to their Ottoman past, although that's also changing as more and more work is being done on the continuity between in terms of the Ottoman city between the Ottoman period and the French period. But a lot of Tunisians go off to shop in Istanbul for the weekend, for example. That's another index of a profound friendship if you get on an Air Tunis plane and go do your shopping in Istanbul. Are there a lot of Tunisian university students in Turkish universities? Not the exchanges in that domain are not as frequent as one might expect. Tunisians generally don't study Turkish; they study Italian, French, and increasingly English and German. So that's also another interesting indicator of relationships that I hadn't thought about. The number of Tunisian students. There are probably more Tunisian students in the U.S. studying now than there are in Turkish universities, but it's the language issue, I think.
Gentleman behind.
Okay, that's me, I think. I'm John Iskander, and I'm at the Foreign Service Institute. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind. One has to do with they're both from the Tunisian side of things. I came in a tiny bit late, and you may have addressed a little bit of this before I came, but I'm with respect to Tunisian sort of historiography of these migrations, of these various sorts of migrations coming in to Tunisia from this early period, from before the French in Algeria. How do the Tunisians typically, I mean, are there typical trends that you could lay out for us of how Tunisian historiography has viewed this, and has that changed? What are the sort of trends of that over time would be an interesting question for me. But then secondly, in your sources, which I take it are, of course, mostly to do with these Europeans coming in, do you get a sense of more than what you told us of the indigenous responses. So how are people dealing with this? I mean, are you getting fatwas? Are you getting religious rulings? But also what kind of political things are coming out of the Beylik and so on?
That's a wonderful question about the historiography. Actually, the nationalist, and I meant to talk about that, but I ran out of time. Not surprisingly, the nationalist historiography sort of erased all those folks out of the record because there were only room for colonizer and colonized, nationalist, and French. So we had a very binary approach to Tunisian history from the 19th century on. But in the last, I would say, 2 decades, there's been a concerted push by Tunisian social historians at the University of Tunis, one, and also at La Manouba, to rewrite the narrative. And it's actually quite courageous because they had to go against the nationalist historiography, which is very well entrenched. So how did they start rewriting the narrative? They began by looking at the question of social marginality. And so if you start at that history from below, you start at that level, then you can work the Sicilians and Maltese into the narrative. But they also had to address an even more serious excision, that is of the Tunisian Jews. The Tunisian Jews, in the nationalist version of things, had been largely excised, although part of the sort of the leadership, half of the leadership of the Tunisian Jewish community actually opted to join with the nationalists against the French. So what the Tunisian historians have been doing, and there's lots of trans-Mediterranean exchanges, workshops, edited volumes, conferences with former Tunisian Jews who may now live in Marseille or in various parts of France, but often spend the summer in Tunis. There's been this constant flow of scholarship and collaboration across the Mediterranean, and so now the Tunisian Jews have been worked back into their narrative place, a very important narrative place in that history. Now, this has come at a price because recently, I don't know if you know the work of Paul Sabag, who is a very well-known Tunisian Jewish historian who has written the histories of the city of Tunis. There was a conference in honor of Paul Sabag at the Manouba campus, sponsored by the history department, and it was broken up by some thugs and hoodlums who began accusing the Tunisian historians who had invited their colleagues from France and elsewhere, Italy, whatever, accused them of being Zionist conspirators or something. So, I mean, this has not very often, but in at least one instance, got a bit ugly. And I don't even know who was behind the attacks on this group of historians. I mean, it's not clear whether it was Ben Ali or anyway. So the historiography, I would say, of the four Maghreb states, including Libya, of course, who often gets lifted out of the Maghreb. Yeah. Of those 4 states, I would say the Tunisian historiography has changed the most and is the most in tune with recent sort of cutting-edge trends in history and the writing and narrating and researching of history. And that has made the most room for all of these folks that were excised from the nationalist narrative. So the second point was about the indigenous response. One of the things I didn't get to talk about too much or at all really was the question of familiar strangers. Some of the people that are showing up in North Africa are particularly the Maltese, who speak, as you know, African. They speak medieval African Arabic, so they speak a Semitic tongue, and we're the sort of the go-betweens of the Mediterranean world. Some of the labor immigrants are quite familiar to the Tunisians. So the Maltese used to act as mediators in ransoming of Muslim slaves held on Catholic Mediterranean islands. And the Sicilians had been, particularly masons and skilled artisans and people in the building trades, had been imported from Sicily and Italy from the late 18th century on. Tunisian Muslim aristocrats began sort of restructuring their palaces and in an Italianate style. So there's a great demand for Sicilian skilled labor. So these people are much more familiar than other folks might be. And so the question, of course, arises, who's a stranger and who's an expatriate. The one thing that, as I mentioned sort of briefly towards the end of my talk, is the fact that this culture, what had been a private culture of the consumption of alcohol, and of course the Bay allows what is known in Arabic as khal, vinegar, into the country, but that you automatically know it's spirits and wines that are coming in. You just call it vinegar, and so there had been a very sort of a discreet consumption of alcohol in the country, mainly by notables attached to the Beylikul family or to high-ranking officials. In fact, once Tunisian diplomats or officials are dispatched to France, they end up at dinner parties in Paris where they imbibe champagne, but they always take pains to say that the physician had prescribed champagne as for my various ailments, particularly gout. So, no, this is recorded on numerous occasions. In 1824, a Tunisian diplomat was dispatched to the new king's celebration in Paris, and it was noted that he was quite fond of the drink, but he repeatedly made sure that everyone knew that it was prescribed by his actually Jewish Italian physician who were very prominent at the court, at the Bey's court in Tunis. So there was this private consumption, and not among ulama families, but among sort of the Turco-Arab political elites. But once it becomes very public, and there are brawls in taverns, and there are taverns and cafes springing up all throughout the Tunis Medina, and sometimes taverns are open near or right in front of mosques or prayer rooms. That's when things get contentious, and there is a huge complaint literature in the Beylikul archives and the pre-colonial archives in Tunis in Arabic, and it's written by local representatives, maybe a governor or an official, the Kahi at the port or something, complaining about the Maltese are drunk again, the Sicilians are dealing in contraband arms. So there is this complaint literature, and it's quite rich, and it gives you a sense of what it was like to be living next door to a newly opened Sardinian tavern or wine shop. But on the other hand, it's hard to make a generalization. On the other hand, we find a lot of Sardinians, Sicilians, and Maltese are once again in household service, living at the heart in the households of the beys and the grandees of Tunis. And this raised an issue for me because of the purity pollution taboos that one finds in Morocco. Now, religious Moroccan, very pious Moroccan families in this period would never have allowed, as far as I can tell from my fellow historians of 19th century Morocco, would never have allowed, for example, a Christian or Jew to prepare their food, or because of this sort of strictly observed pollution taboo. But in the Tunisian case, we find households, the Bey's household has lots of Jewish retainers, and Jewish Italian physicians attend to the members of his family, including the women, through a curtain. So it's this is a very different sort of social milieu than one finds, for example, in Fez in the period. I hope, did that sort of answer your question? And I've read the correspondence between the palace, the Beys, the Tunisian state, from the 18th century, all the way from the 18th century, with as many different European powers as there, and the correspondence is tens of thousands of documents all the way into the 19th century. And this is the kind of complicated picture that I came up with. And remember, a lot of the Tunisian, the wives of the Beys are, well, we can't really call them Italian, because one of my arguments is if we use those ethnic tags, then we're not getting it, because, of course, in this period, the Sicilians don't think of themselves as Italian. They're not even Sicilians. They're from Marsala in western Sicily, or they're from Gozo in the Maltese Islands, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Two questions, David, and then the gentleman to you, down the table, two spaces.
I was visiting Tunisia back, I think, in 2006 or 7, and ended up at a garden party at the British Embassy.
Oh, good for you. That's a nice place to go.
Talking to a white Russian.
Oh, okay.
And then he started telling me about this whole community of white Russians in Tunis. And I'm wondering if in your studies you came across this community and what you make of their presence there.
apparently, during World War I, a boatload of white Russians was trying to get somewhere across the Med, and they got diverted, as so many ships did. And the only place that they could disembark, does this sound right, was Tunis?
I can't remember.
Oh, actually, I think this is how that came about, and they're still there today, some of them.
There are a number of thousands of them.
Yes. Oh, well, you've been to Tunis. You know how nice it is. Why leave Tunis if you...
Must have been a big boat.
Must have been a big boat.
Oh.
So that's, and actually there is a recently published book on that, and I will get it to you, David, okay? Yeah, on the White Russian. Yes, exactly.
In Russian?
No, in French, of course.
In French. Okay.
Actually, there are White Russians everywhere. Shanghai and Tianjin both have had huge White Russian colonies. On the subject of migration, you've talked about now north-south, but I once had a American colleague who's has Sicilian ancestry, and we once had a postdoc from Corsica, French postdoc from Corsica, and they were both quite amused by the fact that on a long scale that their family history, in fact, was half French, half North African. Mm-hmm. And so to what extent, when you're talking about Sicilians and Corsicans and Maltese going to North Africa, in fact, this is part of what has been a millennia-long intermixing, and so that they would not be that unfamiliar.
The one thing that happened, but it caused a huge scandal, was intermarriage. Because the Maltese and Sicilians were, of course, 100% Catholic, and intermarriage between the Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim communities was theoretically something that didn't happen, but in fact it did happen. It's one of these sort of hidden stories. And if you look closely at the parish records at the cathedral in downtown Tunis, which I was not able to see because the sister in charge of the records wouldn't let me see them for various reasons I won't go into. But anyway, a colleague got in to see these records, and it turns out there are families that had crossed back and forth between two of the children are named Mohammed and Fatima, and the other two are named Nicole and Francois. And so all of a sudden you're thinking, I wonder what's going on there. So there was, the older historiography, back to the great question about historiography. In the older historiography, no one ever converted and no one ever intermarried. Now, of course, we all know as social and cultural historians that people are always transgressing boundaries. And so if you dig deeper in the record, you find Maltese girl who falls in love with the Muslim butcher down the street, and then you can just imagine what happens. And of course, it causes a huge brouhaha. And in fact, now the Tunisian ulama did not view favorably conversion from these Catholic communities to Islam because it created such an enormous international imbroglio. And the Beys were very much opposed to that as well. And there are even cases of people who converted from Catholicism to Islam and then reconverted, which makes you an apostate in Islam, which is also a not very good thing to do. So these kinds of stories were hidden and concealed and not talked about and didn't make their way into the historical narrative, but they did happen. Now, of course, theoretically, for a Catholic woman doesn't have to convert to marry a Muslim man. That's not, but it's the reverse that requires a conversion. But there are lots of families with great aunts who are now pious Muslims who once were Italian Catholics, and people just, I don't know, they either don't talk about it at all because it's so normalized, or they don't want to talk about it. But you're right, there was movement back and forth. But marriage was theoretically the sexual sort of border or boundary between the communities.
Do you have a timeline as to when that really became a big border? 1,000 was it a big border?
Oh, in 1,000? You want me to go back that far? You'll regret it because as historians will go on forever.
We've got 10 minutes.
Yes and no. I'm going to punt like the historian has to do with I think we should go back to Muslim Spain, and there's lots of great research coming out on Muslim, and sort of a new wave of research on Muslim Spain and Muslim Sicily, and look into those very questions of marriage across religious borders and what they entailed.
Is that it for that question?
You want?
Well, no, there may
Said I
be.
was punting.
I haven't seen any other hands,
Oh, okay.
but Kent's got another question. But wait a minute, Kent. Is there anybody else that wants to ask a question
How about
before
Dane?
Kent?
Dane was supposed to lead the discussion, and he.
Okay, here we go. Here we
Dane
go.
had to leave. Okay.
You covered alcohol. I'm just curious about hashish. Who used it,
great
and
question.
how did migration affect its use?
Okay, that's a great question. In fact, takruri, which is the Arabic term for the plant that was grown notably in the Rif Mountains in Morocco, as everybody knows, it's showing up in large quantities in Amsterdam and has been for a long time. But the Husseinid state, along with the religious authorities, repeatedly banned the cultivation or use of takruri, which of course means that everybody's doing it. And one way they dealt with the problem sounds like the Arizona-Mexico border. You burn the stuff. So they're constantly seizing it and burning it down by the Buhaira or the lake. Still, it's around, and it's not as offensible as alcohol in the eyes of the ulama, but it's almost as bad as alcohol. Of course, pork being the worst. Consumption of pork, and then alcohol, and then takruri or keef. So keef is associated. Keef is tobacco mixed with hash. So it's sort of associated with low life. Algerian soldiers in the French colonial army who headed over the border because they didn't want to fight for France anymore. They're often accused in the record throughout the 19th century of selling keef, of being the guys who are sort of purveyors of keef, and so it's associated with sort of low migrants, low life, etc. Now, there's a huge contraband trade in the stuff between Tunisia and Mediterranean ports, and it turns out that Malta is not only a center for contraband keef, but also for contraband prostitutes and contraband slaves. And I didn't get to talk about abolition, but abolition is another important piece of this. We won't go there, I know. We only have 2 minutes. Don't worry. Roger's looking sort of dismayed. But Malta is supposed to be the center of abolition and the center of the glorious British imperial commerce, but in fact it turns out to have been a contraband center, a prostitution center, and also a center for continual traffic in African and white slaves, even after abolition in 1860 and abolition in the 1840s in Tunisia and the French Empire.
There was a hand up down here, and then Kent, but you go first.
You want to know about harems, probably. That's
actually, I was going to ask more haram, and you mentioned pork, and I'm curious of how the Sicilian and Italian communities, if there was any kind of connection of contraband, ham, or otherwise.
What they did do is I'm glad you asked that question, because in my notes I meant to mention that these are rural to urban. In other words, rural people are migrating to coastal cities and towns. So it's a rural to urban migration, and there's a ruralization of parts of the Tunis Medina, which didn't make the Sheikh al-Medina very happy or the municipal authorities. And precisely, the Sicilians and Maltese start having pigs running around the Medina, which of course did not make the Jews and Muslims happy at all. And I introduced, made associations between impurity and pollution and these newcomers. So that's also something else that needs to be considered. It's sort of interesting to think about the 3 Ds of migration: diet, disease, and dress. And then, of course, in the Mediterranean world, the diet is more or less the same. People retain their Greek dress or whatever, and it's the same sort of disease profile. But when you get to pork, that's a very interesting question. Now, on the other hand, anyone who's been to Tunisia knows that you can get sanglier up in the north, and that Tunisians do eat sanglier, and sanglier are considered pig, right? Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like the champagne.
They must,
for medicinal purposes.
Probably, or maybe they define it as some other kind of.
Maybe they define it as some other, not as a pork animal.
Okay. There was a question. I thought I saw a microphone being passed.
Yes. I'll make it very short. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown. I read your book, Rebels and Saints, in one of my classes and was deeply touched by the spirit of Bouzillien. And your new book is Mediterranean. It's totally different in terms of style, and this is more everyday life. And also you add some spatial theory about the Mediterranean corridor into it. And in today's lecture, I was struck by one sentence you said, "What mental universe move with a migrant?" And I just want to know a little bit more. How would you incorporate spatial theory with writing everyday life of ordinary people? Something like that.
That's a very good question. And once again, because 99% of the people that I was interested in were illiterate, and maybe the story only got written several generations later when they go to a French school. And so there are a lot of Italian memoirs coming out now in French by Sicilians who now write in French to talk about their family's Sicilian sort of journey. So so you're absolutely right about the difficulty of recreating the mental universe. We know something about how middle class and bourgeois people traveled and thought, because of course they produce voluminous writings, and as you know, there are thousands of travel accounts. My visit to the Maltese island, followed by adventures in sunny Tunisia or whatever. So we have quite more than enough on the mental universe of well-heeled bourgeois travelers. But for the ordinary folks, it's quite elusive. But that's a great question. And I guess to make a connection between Rebel and Saint and this book is, remember in Rebel and Saint I got into contraband? That's what led me then to try and write a whole book on contraband. And I still could do it. I have enough archival documentation. If anyone's interested, I'll write the book. I mean, I got all the documents at home. But then that, as I explained in my talk, shoved me into another story, or a related story about people on the move. But I mean, the use of space is very important. For example, a lot of impoverished Maltese and Sicilian families subletted from people in the Medina who were Jews or Muslims, who are subletting, and of course there are no written contracts, and the historian only catches this by when there's some fight breaks out about who can inhabit this space that's been subletted out 10 times to 10 different groups. But from that I know that actually there were these impoverished families living in wakala, or in these sort of temporary residences normally used by Tunisian single male laborers, barania, from the provinces while they were working in Tunis. But as more and more families migrated to Tunis, at first it was mainly single males, and then it rapidly became family migration. They often could only find residential space in these parts of the Medina where they were once again rubbing shoulders with Tunisian Muslim and Jewish families and others. So in many cases they occupy exactly the same sorts of spaces as the Tunisians. Now what's interesting in space is also the missionaries, which I didn't get to them either, although I talked about chaste Catholic nuns.
You're just leaving a lot of things we'll have to read.
I know, you'll have to invite me back for part 2.
Well,
but the missionaries actually chose to inhabit maisons mauresques. That is to say, they elected to stay in what they called Moorish houses, which is to say Tunisian residential space, and it was a way of acculturating themselves or not appearing too foreign or unfamiliar wherever they might be located in the Medina or out in the Carthage suburbs. So
typical for missionaries, isn't it?
That's right,
Yeah.
yes.
We have time for Kent's question.
Kent is dying to ask about harems.
And we have to live with him for the rest of this year, too.
I'll be more discreet than that. Thank you. I was curious if the Berbers have a distinct narrative still, and if there's a continued interest in a degree of autonomy that preserves some language rights and so forth.
Actually, only less than 1% of the Tunisian population is Berber. They're found in the south. There's not a very strong Berber identity in Tunisia compared to Algeria, the Kabylia, or to Morocco, but particularly the Algerian Kabyles. Some of the largest Berber populations in 19th century Tunisia were actually Zawawa, or Berbers recruited from the Kabylia to fight as mercenaries in the Bey's army. So there is a Berber component to the population of Tunisia. It's not necessarily indigenous. Once again, the largest concentration was from Algeria. Lots of Kabyles migrated to Tunisia after French colonialism to Tunis from eastern Algeria, because eastern Algeria has always been sort of a in the Tunis-Carthage orbit. So there were lots of Berbers living, including Fatma Amrouche, who was the mother of Jean Amrouche and Taous Amrouche, two very well-known French literati. So there are Berbers, but the identity thing is not, it's not that pronounced, and it's quite different from the Kabylia, but that's a great question.
I think that's about time to, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there usually has been a reception outside at the end of this seminar. So if that's true today, would one of you nod your head? Okay. Sure. Then we can adjourn out there and ask more questions, have a glass of wine and a piece of cheese.
We'll pretend it's vinegar.
Have a glass of vinegar.
Julia, we want to thank you for a very